Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our CEBRA webinar, or as we like to fondly call them, CEBRAnars. My name is Jessica May, and I am acting the lead of the Innovation, Legislation and Education branch in the Biosecurity Strategy and Reform Division. So today I would first like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on. For me in Canberra, this is the Ngunnawal people. I acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I extend that recognition to the traditional custodians of all of the other lands on which our staff and participants are gathered today, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples attending today's event. So before we start, I ask if you could please ensure your microphones are muted and your cameras are off. The webinar is being recorded today for those who can't make it, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. So you can either use the hand up gesture or post a comment question in the chat panel on the side. So as a recap, for those of you who haven't been here before, the Centre of Excellence for Biosecurity Risk Analysis, or CEBRA, is a long-standing biosecurity research initiative and plays a vital role in providing the Australian and New Zealand governments with expert biosecurity risk analysis and advice that helps inform a range of biosecurity risk management activities. So today's webinar will feature work undertaken by CEBRA about the use of damage functions to estimate consequences from pests, diseases and climate change. To explain more on this topic, it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Christine Lee, who is a research fellow with CEBRA. Christine is an environmental economist. She holds an honours degree in economics and is commencing a PhD at the University of Melbourne. She has experience in policy and analysis from her time at Deloitte Access Economics, the Victorian Department of Treasury and Finance, and the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Christine is now focused on creating tools for biosecurity decision making and estimating crop yield damage functions for climate impact assessment. So I'll now pass over to Christine to get us underway. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Jess. Let me share my screen. Okay. Thanks to the department for the opportunity to give this presentation. Thank you to Lisa for helping organise this, and thank you for joining my presentation. Today I'll be talking about using damage functions to estimate the consequences from pests, diseases and climate change. So I'd like to talk about why we estimate damage functions, how we estimate damage functions, and I'll also cover two case studies. So first, I'll cover fairly briefly some of the pest damages work done by my CEBRA colleagues. And the second case study, I'll spend most of my time on covering climate crop damages. This work is still work in progress, so it's currently being extended, but I'll be able to talk about some of the challenges and limitations in this work and also some of the opportunities to extend the work as well. So to start with, why do we estimate damage functions and what are they? So damage functions are a formulation of the relationship between hazards and damages. They can be used to describe damages that might increase at a proportional or a constant rate with hazards or in a non-linear, non-constant rate. But our motivation for constructing damage functions is usually to understand the consequences of a hazard in contexts where an event like a pest outbreak hasn't occurred, but could occur. But because it hasn't occurred, its damages can't be observed or measured. But we're often interested in quantifying these damages for scenario modelling so that we can understand the avoided damages or the benefits of having a biosecurity response or a biosecurity system. And so the purpose of using damage functions is to extrapolate from a set of conditions where we have data about the value of damages from hazards, to extrapolate that to a wider set of conditions, including the new context that we might be interested in. And that data might be empirical or experimental, or it might come from simulation or modelling exercises. So we can think of constructing damage functions as a prediction exercise, except we're not necessarily interested in predicting into the future. we might also want to predict or extrapolate across space. So the two most recent projects that we've used damage functions in are to estimate the value of biosecurity system in Australia and New Zealand, a previous project done for DAF and also a current project for MPI. And the other project is on estimating biosecurity risks from changing trade patterns and climate change. So moving on to how to estimate damage functions. So as I said before, it's a prediction exercise, but there's no best way to estimate damage functions. We generally take an approach that at a high level includes aggregating data, fitting a model, and then making a prediction. And this approach borrows from both benefit transfer and statistical techniques. So for those not familiar, benefit transfer is a procedure where we take the estimates of economic value gathered from one site and we apply them to another with some adjustment or transformation to contextualize those estimates to a new setting. But we want to start with a hypothesis that hazards cause damages, how they cause damages, and how the damages might vary under different conditions or different confounding factors. We would then generally conduct a literature review to aggregate data from multiple studies, including expert elicitation, and then we would fit a statistical model from that collected data. An optional step here is to also conduct a formal meta-analysis to account for dependencies in the data, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. And then the final step is to then use the damage function to predict damages in new places and future time periods. So if we think about estimating damages in theory, damages are a very general term. They really need to be contextualized in terms of what is being damaged. So we generally understand damages from pests and diseases in terms of crop yield losses, or in the case of non-portfolio asset types, degraded asset values. But damages can depend on many different factors. So economic yield losses are mostly directly related to the severity of physical plant injury from pests feeding on a plant, and that's often a non-linear kind of damage function, which means that the amount of damage depends on the degree of injury in a variable way. So it doesn't increase, damages don't increase at a constant rate. This figure shows how yields might theoretically decrease with increasing injury. So that's an example of a non-linear damage function where different portions of this damage injury curve show plant tolerance to injury and then overcompensation and eventually desensitization where the yields flatten out. But the amount of damages from a pest can also vary with the extent of invasion, which also means that the benefit from each additional dollar of spent on controlling a pest or a disease might not be constant. And as we know, some pests have impacts that explode very quickly soon after arrival and establishment. They can have very large impacts even at low population density, like pests that affect, that affect exports that require area freedom certification, while other pests have impacts that are initially low and then only become large once pest densities are extremely large and difficult to eradicate. So these estimates usually come from experiments or from measurements of plant injury or yield loss, field observations, and where they're not available or where they are available, we can also try to model these and estimate these pest damages for our situation. There's, again, no single way to model these pest damages, but the best approach will depend on the spatial resolution of the area that's under focus. It'll depend on data availability and also the number of pest species and asset groups being damaged. So, for example, if we're looking at an area where the spatial resolution is very fine and there are many different pest species and asset types being estimated, then it can be practical to just assume constant average damages. where damages decline in a proportional way. So that's done in the Biosecurity System Value Project, which brings us to the first case study. So I'll cover fairly briefly part of the work that my CEBRA colleagues did for this project. So Aaron Dodd, Natalie Sturkel, John Baumgartner, and Tom Compass. But I encourage you to listen to Aaron Dodd's recording for the recording of Aaron Dodd's CEBRAnar early in the year for a more in-depth understanding of this project. The part of the project that I want to talk about are the steps that are taken to quantify the vulnerability of 6 different asset groups to some 40 functional groups of pest species. So in the model, these...
So you literally have to...
in the model, these estimates are represented as a percentage reduction in the asset value. Portfolio damages, which are damages to agriculture and forestry, by and large came from ABARES estimates for the RRA, so the risk return resource allocation model. And those were expressed in percentage yield and percentage price reductions. Non-portfolio asset damages, which we also care about, they include things like provisioning assets like water, regulating assets like toxin mediation, cultural assets, domestic animals and infrastructure. Damages to those sorts of assets from pests and diseases were estimated in a more complex process. So there were 2 different data sources. The first data source was an expert elicitation exercise that ABARES did in 2014. And that exercise produced a matrix of Likert scores ranging from 0 to 4 on the relative severity of each of those 40 groups to a different set of non-portfolio asset groups. The second data source was a literature search that Aaron and Natalie did, where they aggregated data from 41 studies containing 66 estimates on the absolute absolute percentage reduction in damages for a subset of species. So those non-market estimates came mostly from studies that used traditional non-market valuation techniques like choice modelling or contingent valuation to measure people's willingness to pay to avoid damages to those sorts of assets. And then what Aaron and Natalie did was to remap those Likert scores from the expert elicitation exercise to the non-portfolio asset groups. So they essentially converted those scores ranging from 0 to 4 into actual percentage declines in assets by mapping the score for each specific pest and asset encounter to one of the 66 estimates from the literature with a log transformation. So we can kind of think of this as a prediction exercise where the team predicted non-market values from the literature on expert elicited scores using a simple logarithmic model. And the end result is a table of proportional declines in asset values. And these can be interpreted as steady state, excuse me, steady state average damages once the pest establishment is complete. So the value model, as some of you know, did a lot more than just quantify damages. It also used spatial simulation to model the arrival, establishment and spread of those 40 functional groups of pest species across Australia. So it's the combination of damages, but also the frequency and the spread of those pests causing those damages that is then used to estimate the total damages that might be expected with and without the Australian biosecurity system, and to then quantify the value of the Australian biosecurity system. So again, please listen to the recording of Aaron's CEBRAnar for more information about that project. So I'll move on to the second case study, which is using damage functions to estimate climate damages to crops. So we know that many biological and climatic factors affect crop development, growth, and yields, like temperature, water, humidity, gases, nutrients. And the schematic on the right here shows how plants and soil take in water, radiation, and temperature and CO2 to produce growth and yields. For our project on estimating biosecurity risks from changing trade patterns under climate change, we also want to understand how these crop yields might change under climate change. So that motivates the use of damage functions. Other than these variables, there are also different windows of temperature across a growing period that are optimal for vegetative development, reproductive development, and maximum grain yield, and failure point temperatures past which grain yield falls to zero. So rising temperatures can affect crop health and productivity by affecting the length of growing seasons, accelerating crop maturity, and then ultimately decreasing yield in some areas. And daily extreme temperatures can also fall outside of the optimum temperature range for growth. But we also know that CO2 can have a positive effect on photosynthesis and water retention. So a number of process-based crop models are used to simulate these relationships and explore some of the dynamics and thresholds and predict growth and yield responses to changes in climatic factors. And there's a very large body of literature that uses crop models to do just that, basically explore how crop productivity might change with gradual changes in the climate. So what we do for this project is we draw on a number of estimates from crop simulation models in the literature so that we can estimate climate crop damage functions for the 4 major staple crops that make up over half of the world's caloric intake, which is maize, rice, soy, and wheat. So to estimate these damage functions of crop yield change in response to temperature change, we actually took a compilation of studies that were present in the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, or the CGIAR database. These 89 studies included a mix of estimates from statistical modelling, experimental data, field observations, and process-based crop simulation models. And including simulation models is significant because it means that we're not just using historical data to predict future data. But the database included estimates of relative yield change, temperature change in degrees, CO2 change, and precipitation change. So we started with doing some data grooming. So we went through all of the studies to check each estimate one by one and correct any mistakenly entered data points. We also encountered missing data. And so we used a procedure called MICE to impute those missing values so that we're not fitting a model to an imbalanced data set. We did some formal meta-analysis, which I'll talk about next. But really what we're interested in is estimating the true relationship between temperature change and yield change across all of the possible studies, of which these 89 studies is just a random, you can think of as a random draw. So we included variables in our damage function that the theory says should impact yield change, including variables that weren't included in the CGIAR database, like baseline growing season temperature. And that captures the intuition that yields in a hot place will respond to further temperature changes differently from yields in a cold place. And we fit a series of different candidate models, including OLS, generalized additive mixed models, and generalized linear mixed models. But the model that we landed on after model cross-validation for the results that I'm showing today was a generalized additive mixed model with study and country random effects. And that means that we're assuming the countries and studies in our data set represent just a random sample of studies and countries that are the universal studies and countries. So we'll do a quick detour on meta-analysis. So with meta-analysis, we're interested in studying studies. So if we think about the CGIAR database that these damage functions are based on, That database has a nested hierarchical structure in that there are 89 studies, but each study might have point estimates for one or more countries. And then within each study country group, there might be multiple estimates as well that correspond to different temperature and rainfall scenarios. So we want to account for the dependencies within the same study and also the same country so that we can reduce the bias in estimates and variance. If we don't account for that, then the variance across the estimates will look artificially low because you'd actually expect those estimates to be related to each other because they come from the same study or the same country. And so we want to do this to reduce bias, essentially. So part of the meta-analysis included doing a meta-analysis on the correlations between yield changes and temperature change in the data set. And one of the inputs is this forest plot, which shows the variance of different estimates of correlation across the different studies. This one is for one of the maize data sets. It shows a slightly negative correlation overall between yield and temperature change. But when you're dealing with a well-structured data set, it's also possible to estimate your damage functions using meta-regression, which essentially weights the data points in the sample by the confidence that you have in each study based on the sample size. We don't actually perform meta-regression in our climate crop damage functions because it's not appropriate to the data set. And it's because if we were to account for all of the combinations of the variables in our data set, it would just be too many subgroups to do. But that's something that you can certainly do for estimating damage functions. So these are the predicted damage functions. So the figure on the right shows some partial effects plots of the predicted damage functions of percentage yield change in response to each additional degree of mean global warming. So when we express this in relative yield changes, well, we've expressed this in relative yield changes, but we've also done this with absolute yield changes as well. These plots show yield changes at the median baseline temperature for each crop for each data set, and all of the other change variables are held at 0. But we've also done plots at different baseline temperatures, and the plots look different at different baseline temperatures. So at a baseline temperature, growing season temperature of 5 degrees, almost all of these functions are upward sloping, which means that 1 to 5 degrees of warming would increase yields across the board. But at a baseline temperature of 25 degrees, it's essentially far too hot already. So damage functions the damage functions are very steeply decreasing, which means that any further warming results in quite steep yield reductions. But then when we actually apply these predicted damage functions to understand what global predicted yield might look like, what we then have to do is predict those damage functions on a set of prediction data. So the prediction data is constructed by taking all of the variables in our damage function and then estimating those at 0 to 5 degrees of mean global warming. And so for temperature change, baseline growing season temperature, CO2, we essentially calculate those values downscaled from each degree of mean global warming. We hold precipitation change to 0 for this exercise, which I'll talk about in a bit. And we also fix adaptation to 0. So this figure is an example of what the yield reductions might look like at 0 to 5 degrees for maize. You can see that at pretty much from 1 or 2 degrees of warming, there are yield reductions across Africa and Asia. but there are also increased yields in parts of the world like Greenland, Alaska, Patagonia, and the Tibetan Plateau, but reductions almost everywhere else. We want to be cautious about interpreting yield increases in locations where crops aren't currently grown, because temperature alone isn't really enough to make an area arable, especially if those areas aren't currently accessible or cropped. And so it makes sense to weight predictions by where crops actually are currently grown, which brings us to our next map. So the previous map showed gridded predictions at a fairly fine spatial resolution. Here we've aggregated those predictions to the country level using weights on crop production. And so there are some pretty different patterns here. There are also some implications for food security. So across all of the crops, generally Africa and Southeast Asia see the largest reductions in yields, but some countries in the northern latitudes also appear to have some future advantages in growing wheat. At 1 degree of mean global warming from a baseline period that we set at 2015 to 2020, we find that overall globally there would be across the different crops between 3 to 17% reduction in total production and yields. And interestingly, the effects on production tonnage, the damages increase almost linearly, actually, with each degree of mean global warming. But we think that this is likely an underestimate, at least in some regions, because these predictions don't reflect changing rainfall patterns. What I said before about holding precipitation change at zero, whereas we know with pretty high confidence now that the Mediterranean region, Southern Africa, Western Australia, Chile, Central America will all be much drier than now. So what we're working on now is the interaction between water stress and heat stress. And we're also in the process of converting these predictions from per degree increases in mean global warming to annual RCP scenarios. But essentially, we use these predicted damages as inputs into climate and trade modelling. So for the 21B project and the Scion MPI project, we show how supply shocks in agriculture can cause trade patterns to change, and that in turn causes pest import contamination risks to change as well. That's something that Tom Compass and James Kamak are working on now. I'll show this map as well, which is a map from Tom Compass and Van Van Haar. This map illustrates the sort of application of the damage function predictions that I just showed you. So they actually use an older set of damage functions for crop productivity, labour productivity, and sea level rise under a climate change scenario, emission scenario of RCP 8.5. And this map represents losses in annual GDP by 2100 relative to a baseline year of 2015. And it shows that there are between 1 to 28% GDP losses, depending on the country. So Tom will talk more in depth about this climate and trade modelling in the October CEBRAnar. So as I mentioned before, one of the current extensions that we're working on is to incorporate future rainfall patterns into the global predictions. We're also really interested in extremes and variability. So one of the limitations in fitting a statistical model of damage functions, as we do here, is that we're constrained to using average baseline temperatures. And that can obscure the variation in temperatures within a growing season, as well as the range of temperatures across a day, the diurnal range in temperature. But There are many experiments that show that crops can be quite badly affected when they're exposed to certain minimum or maximum temperatures for even a few hours during a critical phenological stage. So we want to extend this work to consider how those extremes might affect yields. And then another area where I think damage functions need to be used differently are rapid onset hazards like bushfires and floods and storm surges. So if we think about the damage functions on crop yields, those deal with scenarios that are pretty much locked in already in terms of the gradual rise in global mean global warming. But there are also many other hazards that are much more random, where we actually haven't used damage functions because it's much harder to hypothesize a general or theoretical relationship between hazards and damages. Tom's work on floods and storm surges and my work on bushfires have both taken an alternative approach to actually simulate the future frequency and magnitude of these sorts of random extreme events. And we do that by using historical data on frequency and magnitude of floods, storm surges, and bushfires. And we also use projections of the increases in the frequency of those extreme events from the Bureau of Meteorology and other data sources. And then we simulate future frequency and magnitude by taking random draws from those distributions. Moving beyond crop yields, so Tom Compass has done a lot of work to fit damage functions to labour productivity and sea level rise. And so altogether, they're perhaps not universal, not a universal coverage of all of the different kinds of damages expected under climate change, but it is quite clear what is included. And another exciting extension for us will be integrating pest damages with climate damages on crops. And so to do that, we would need to consider the changing climate suitability for pests, which is something James Kamak is working on now, and the pests of the 4 major crops that we focus on here, so maize, rice, soy, and wheat. And we'd also need to consider the changing climate suitability for crops and doing that better, and also understanding better the interactions between pest damages and climate damages. So to summarize, we use damage functions to predict the consequences when and where data are scarce. There are many different ways of doing this, but generally we follow an approach that uses benefit transfer techniques to aggregate data, fit a model, and predict across time and space. And that might also involve doing formal meta-analysis and/or expert elicitation. And we've used this approach to estimate asset damages from pests and diseases, and also crop damages from climate change. So the next steps we're going to take is to figure out how to integrate climate and pest damages better, and also move beyond averages to better understand damages from random extremes in rainfall and drought. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christine. That was a great presentation. Is there any questions? Could they throw them in the chat, or if anyone wants to put their hand up? But I might kick off with one. So once you have sort of completed this project, what's the real world applications that you can see being applied or being used by this research?
That's a great question, Jess. I think that, well, aside from, I guess, the use of the prediction outputs in, further prediction of changing pest risks and so on, I'd hope that the work could be used in maybe scenario planning for different adaptation. So one of the for example, going back to the climate crop damages, one of the variables that we look at as well is adaptation. So it would be really good to understand actually how different types of adaptation might reduce predicted yield responses. And hopefully that could have some practical insights on the sorts of impact reducing actions that farmers could take. And I think a similar application is being used could be used for biosecurity risks for crops biosecurity risks from pests and diseases as well, in that if we can actually work on, understanding what actions reduce the biosecurity risks, then we can actually better plan for those incursions.
Yes, and I know it's definitely top of mind for a lot of us at the moment about the climate change and what pests and diseases may potentially live in Australia now with the changing climate versus that didn't before. So definitely at forefront. Have we got any other questions in the group for Christine? Okay, there's one. Is anyone doing, this kind of work on long-lived species in orchards like apples, oranges, and almonds?
Thanks, Mark. That's a question I don't know the answer to. I know in the CGIAR data set, at least, there were some data points on perennial crops like the ones you mentioned, but the data really was much scarcer than for kind of the 4 major crops. And so, you'd probably be able to find individual studies, but I'm not sure about an actual meta-analysis of those studies.
Great, thank you. And what are the international applications for this? Is it very Australia focused, or is it something that can be applied in New Zealand, etc.?
Yeah, good question. I think it's definitely quite international because the predictions for the climate crop work, at least, were done globally at a fairly fine 0.5 by 0.5 degree scale, which is about 50 kilometers at the equator. Because it was done at that scale, we can actually zoom into different countries and be able to break down, at a subnational level where we might see different changes in yield damages.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time, Christine. Just to let everyone know, the next CEBRAnar is scheduled for the 29th of September on a Thursday, and it will feature research undertaken on incentive-compatible biosecurity regulations. That's a mouthful. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Christine, thank you so much for that presentation. It was wonderfully insightful. Loved having you, and we will see you at the next CEBRAnar. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, everyone.